Hi, I'm Marc Scott Zicree, author of the Twilight Zone Companion, and you are watching Life Minute TV.
Hi, I'm Ann Serling, and you're watching Life Minute TV.
You're traveling through another dimension.
That voice, those looks, that groundbreaking show that can only be Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone. It captivated millions and still does to this day through its 156 episodes available to stream on Paramount Plus. You can also buy The Twilight Zone the complete series on Blu-ray. This Christmas marks what would have been Serling's 100th birthday. We caught up with his daughter Anne, who wrote a memoir honoring the legacy of her dad, and Marc Scott Zicree, author of the popular Twilight Zone Companion, to celebrate the man, the myth, and the legend this holiday season.
It's stunning to think that my dad would be 100 years old. I can't even imagine him as an old man. He was only 50 when he died. And my last image of him is this tan face and, this wavy hair and not looking old at all. So it's stunning, but it's also lovely that people remember him so fondly.
I'm really glad that we're commemorating Rod's 100th birthday. Again, there's always the bittersweet quality that Rod died at 50, and now here we are at 100. And what would he, even as a 100-year-old, I'm sure he would have had a lot to say about the current situation. But his work has lasted. And, when you realize this is from the late 50s and early 60s, and yet it's still every bit as timely, every bit as powerful as it was when it initially aired. I think that's a testament to one of the great artists who's worked in any medium, actually. He's television's Leonardo da Vinci, really. And I think Rod is famous in two ways. One is that he was this amazing writer, this amazing creator of television. That was his art form, but also this phenomenal media personality. There's only a handful of them. James Dean, Elvis, Marilyn Monroe, but Rod Serling, he's beloved and recognizable by, millions of people around the world. It's phenomenal.
I've had people tell me that they thought of my father as their father, and
Mhm.
several actually that said they had tumultuous childhoods and that my dad got them through watching his episodes and seeing him,
Next week on the
introduce them.
Twilight Zone, we bring to the
And no one
television
would be more
cameras a most
surprised than
unique
my
gentleman
father
whose
that
own
he's
very
remembered
special
like
brand of
this.
clownship.
People who are young now don't really understand the incredible power of television when there were only three networks. Everyone watched pretty much everything one way or another. You knew who all these people were, and because they came into your home every week, they did have a feeling of being your family, a feeling of great familiarity. But with Rod, I think it's even more than that because there's a feeling of authenticity. The man who's there on the screen, you feel that if you ran into him in a restaurant or a bar, you'd love to just sit down with him and that he'd be as wonderful in person as
Now
he
the new
was on
series is
screen. And
unexpected and
that's
quite
why
incredible.
Anne's memoir
On
about
the
her dad
Twilight
is so
Zone Academy.
wonderful because she takes us into that world and we get to know so much more about Rod. And I'm so glad you wrote that book, Anne.
Sometime after he died, I started another book called In His Absence, and I hadn't even begun to navigate the grief. So it took me years to write as I knew him. And again, one of the reasons was I find writing cathartic, as my dad did.
Mm.
And so it was a way to work it out. I also wanted to know more about the professional side of my dad. And lastly, I wanted to address how some people had thought he was this dark, tortured soul because my father was the polar opposite. He was silly, he was funny, he loved the Flintstones, he loved animals. He was a practical joker, just the opposite of what one would imagine.
Yeah, and I'd like to add something to that because again, there were several biographies that sort of position Rod as this dark, tragic figure who was so disappointed in life and so broken by life. And it's a total fiction and very unfair to Rod because he had an astonishing life
End of
force,
fantasy on the
both
Twilight
creatively and
Zone next
personally.
week as
He
two
was so
distinguished
alive and
actors, Mr.
so
David
active and
Wayne and
such
Mr.
such a
Thomas
great
Gomez
dad, such a
appear
wonderful
in
person. When I was a kid, the three shows that made me want to be a writer were the original Star Trek, the original Outer Limits, and the original Twilight Zone. And by the time I got out of college with my art degree, I knew I wanted to be a writer, producer working in television, but there were no classes in that. There was nobody to learn it. And it was 2 years after Rod's death, and I thought, well, maybe I'll be able to learn how to make great television by exploring the greatest show ever made. And beyond that, I was a huge fan of the show, of course. How
by no
could you
means.
not be? And I'd met one of the writers, George Clayton Johnson, when I was 16 at a convention, because I noticed that the same writers' names were on all these different shows, and they were the writers who were writing the books that I was reading: Ray Bradbury, Richard Matheson, Theodore Sturgeon, Harlan Ellison, Charles Beaumont, Ray Bradbury. So I wanted to meet these people, and so I met George Clayton Johnson. He wrote Kick the Can and Nothing in the Dark, two great Twilight Zone episodes, and he was very encouraging. And so when I came up with the idea of doing the Twilight Zone Companion, George introduced me to a couple of other people, Buck Houghton and Jerry Soule, and then I reached out to others who had worked on the show. And before I even approached Anne's mom, Carol, because she had already turned down major journalists, and I had like one short story credit, I interviewed 30 people for 3 months who had worked on the show before I even went to Carol. And if Carol had said no, it would have been no. But I thought, look, I've got to know what I'm talking about, and I have to know how I'm going to be able to do this book. I was 22 years old at the time, and she said, yes, you have access to everything, which was incredibly gracious and generous of her. And so I was crawling through the house. It was exactly as Rod had left it in Pacific Palisades. You know, the room full of Emmys and the all the other awards he had won, and the attic full of his scrapbooks and scripts and all of these things. Even his dog was still there, the Irish setter. Well, the book was rejected by 25 publishers over a 2-year period. If not for my wife saying, keep going and let's figure out what's not working here, a lot of editors who hadn't grown up watching The Twilight Zone said, well, why would anyone want a book on a show that's gone off network 15 years ago? And they didn't understand that there was an enormous audience. And so once The Twilight Zone was published, The Twilight Zone Companion was published and was a success, that did open the gates for every show imaginable, fans writing for those shows. And the reason I wrote the book was I wanted to learn how these men who wrote The Twilight Zone came to have minds like that, what shaped them, what made them who they were, and these incredible, brilliant writers. And Rod Serling, wrote the majority. He wrote 92 of the 156 episodes.
Well, he dealt with the human condition, and sadly, so many of these issues are still so prevalent and so relevant.
And I think the other thing is that Rod, as well as having a phenomenal, brilliant mind, he also had an incredible heart. And that heart comes across. I mean, people talk about someone wearing their heart on their sleeve. Well, Rod was handing his heart to the audience, basically. He was saying, and he was not a cynic. He was not a pessimist. He was an optimist. He was hopeful about the human condition. He was always rooting for the little guy. And that comes across. And I think you can watch Twilight Zone episodes again and again because of their compassion, because of their humanity, because of the truth, the authenticity in them. It's not about the twist ending. If it was just about that, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because it would have come and gone, because it would be trivial. But the Twilight Zone is not trivial. It speaks to all of us in a deep way. And you can't watch an episode like Monsters Who Do on Maple Street without a profound understanding of how mob hysteria works. And and I think Rod's message is always, we can do better. Let's do better. And you just love him for that.
Well, he wanted to tell these important issues. He wanted the story of Emmett Till out there.
Yes.
And the quote and Mark, you've said this too, he realized that he launched into the Twilight Zone because he realized an alien could say what a Democrat or a Republican couldn't.
Well, again, he was being so censored. I mean, it was fascinating because it was really a gilded cage. If he was writing about something that was not controversial, like an aging boxer, like Requiem for a Heavyweight, then there was no problem. But if he wanted to write about politics or about racial issues, you mentioned Emmett Till, the black teenager who was murdered. Rod tried a couple times to write a TV play about that, and it was so censored that it was meaningless ultimately. And that's what drove him into the Twilight Zone, the fact that he had so much to say and he was being muzzled. And he was right, that by writing science fiction, fantasy, horror, he could write about the threat of nuclear war. He could write about race relations brilliantly, and it would slip by the censors.
I had not actually watched a lot of the Twilight Zones when my father was alive, and I only did, after he died, more to see him than the actual episode. And one of the ones I watched sometime after he died was In Praise of Pip. And it was so interesting because there's dialogue in there between Jack Klugman and Bill Mumy. It says, "Who's your best buddy, Pip? You are, Pop." And it was a routine that my father and I did. "Who's your best buddy? You are." So I literally found my dad again in the Twilight Zone. That episode and Death's Head Revisited is an incredibly powerful one. walking distance. I think it's so relatable for so many people.
These are great episodes, all of them. And and again, they're so deeply personal with Rod. I mean, it's a lot of people don't know Rod was Jewish, and so the Holocaust was, had enormous power, meaning for him. And so Death's Head Revisited is about the ghosts of the concentration camp inmates coming back to exact justice on a commandant who comes back after the war out of nostalgia. It's a great episode. And In Praise of Pip is about a man who's willing to sacrifice his life to save his son who's been wounded in Vietnam. And I think it may be the first representation of Vietnam in an American drama series. But it's about the love of a father for his child. I'm working with Bill Mumy now on the new show we're doing, Space Command, and I worked with him on Babylon 5. But I first, got to talk with him about his work when I interviewed him for the Twilight Zone Companion. And he did 3 episodes of Twilight Zone, and he's terrific in all 3 of them. And In Praise of Pip is just Jack Klugman, when he was working with Bill Mumy, because he was a little boy at that point. This is before Lost in Space. And he said to Bill, he said, listen, I'm going to be very emotional, and I'm going to be really going through a lot of emotions. Don't be upset by that. And he really walked with him through those scenes because they are very emotional. Because basically he sees his son as a little boy in this amusement park they used to go to, and it's beautifully shot. Klugman is incredible in that episode, and these are jewels. These are amazing episodes if you've never seen them. I urge people to just go out and watch all of them because they're classics because they deserve to be. On the Christmas day, I'm actually going to be on a Coast to Coast, this live radio show that I do with George Noory, who's a huge Twilight Zone fan, and we'll be commemorating Rod and taking phone calls and having people share their reminiscences. Say he was a Christmas present that was delivered unwrapped. So, and do you have plans?
We're going to be in Utah with our daughter and grandkids, and I always take a moment on my dad's birthday just to be alone and to think about him.
Yeah, and then happy birthday, Rod. And thanks for the wonderful Christmas present that you were and are, and what you gave us.
To hear more of this interview, visit our podcast, Life Minute TV, on iTunes and all streaming podcast platforms.